Today I'm going to talk about two things, and one is really why obesity occurs, in particular the neuroscience, and then I'm going to talk about how the operations work. So that's essentially my talk. First of all, I'm going to talk about the law of physics, or the law of thermodynamics, which basically means that energy within a system is always constant. And so if an individual is maintaining a stable weight, it basically means that the intake of calories is exactly equal to the calories that that person is burning out. And quite clearly, for somebody to put on weight, they are eating more calories than they are burning out. And it sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? But obviously it's a lot more complex than that. We know that energy balance is very finely controlled by multiple powerful mechanisms. And just to give you a bit of an example on how fine this system is, take one ginger nut biscuit, which is around 40 calories. Now, if an individual was to eat one ginger nut biscuit per day, every day, over and above their body energy requirements, over a period of 10 years, they will put on 20 kilograms. Wow. Now, do I know whether I've eaten a ginger nut biscuit today more than I should have? I've got no idea. I mean, and so, for example, an individual between the ages of 20 and 65 who eats one ginger nut biscuit over and above their energy requirements, they will put on 90 kilograms over that 45-year period. So it takes a very small amount of food for that to occur. And putting it into perspective, that individual who's eaten 40 calories more a day, that means that they have burnt up 98% of the calories they've eaten, but they have a surplus of only 2%. So it's a very fine system. So what are the causes of obesity? Obviously there's genes and there's environment. And what we now know, and we've got very good evidence, is that the majority of obesity is due to genes, and probably about 80% is caused by genes. Now, how do we know that? We've got two really good lines of evidence. Firstly, adoption studies, and secondly, twin studies. So in adoption studies, they've looked at, say, individuals who come from obese families who are adopted and raised in a thin family. There's an 80% likelihood that they will themselves become obese, even if they are raised in a thin family, and vice versa. Twin studies. This is used a lot in psychology, but basically psychologists in particular are very interested in looking at identical twins and non-identical twins, because identical twins share exactly the same genes. And so basically by working out the differences between the identical and non-identical twins, you can work out what component of obesity is due to genes, and we know it's about 80%. I think one of the best analogies with why obesity occurs was published in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it described the analogy of the loaded gun, in that the genes essentially load the gun in the environment pulls the trigger. And obviously the trigger is the obesogenic environment. Now, this is just a simple graph, really. This is some of our knowledge today.
I'm sure it's not a graph of the female brain.
No. Basically, I put this up because this is a broad brushstrokes of how obesity, appetite, and satiety work. It is very complex. There are multiple mechanisms, there's multiple hormones involved, there's multiple nerve pathways. And this is probably the most basic thumbnail sketch. It's probably way more complicated than this. But this is what we know so far. So what I want to do is just talk about one of the hormones involved, which is leptin, because it's quite an interesting story. And I think understanding how leptin works gives you a bit of an idea on how these hormones actually work. So leptin was discovered about 15, 20 years ago, and it was basically found that leptin decreases appetite and causes satiety, and it's actually released from fat cells. So when an individual has a large amount of too much fat in the peripheral tissues, it releases lots of leptin that goes back to the brain and signals the brain that that individual needs to lose weight to get back to their set point BMI, so the individual has a decrease in hunger and has satiety and decreased appetite. An interesting condition of leptin resistance. Now this mouse on the left basically has insufficient leptin, and this is due to a single genetic defect that the scientists in the lab have generated. So basically there is no leptin getting to this mouse's brain, and it just overeats all the time. And the interesting thing is that when you give this mouse leptin, pretty much within a couple of weeks it turns into the mouse on the right side. Now, leptin resistance has been identified in a very small number of individuals in the world, but it's literally just a handful. So it's not a major mechanism of obesity. So let's talk about the brain. Now, this is where it gets complex. Now, the brain can be divided up into three regions. Now, the oldest part of the brain, and that's the part of the brain that we don't really have any control over, is called the reptilian brain. And it comprises of the midbrain and also the hindbrain. Now, within the midbrain and hindbrain, there are important controls, and they include breathing, sleeping, drinking, sex, and food. And we don't have a lot of control over those things. Take, for example, breathing. How long can you stop breathing for before you pass unconscious and your brain takes over and enables you to breathe again? So there are a lot of unconscious things that happen in this part of the brain, the reptilian brain. Now this is slightly less complex than the other graph, but basically this is the reward circuits in the brain. Okay. Now this part here is the unconscious part of the reward circuit in the brain. And this structure here is called the nucleus accumbens, otherwise known as the pleasure centre. So any happiness or pleasure, this is where it's occurring in these reward circuits. There's one part of the brain that is conscious, and that is the prefrontal cortex. So over here, that is the little wee person who says, no, you shouldn't really do that. And this is the unconscious part. Now, the important thing to say is that this reward circuit is exactly the same that we use for food, is exactly the same reward circuit that is used for multiple other things. So, for example, gambling, sex, alcohol, nicotine, heroin addiction. And this is why it's so incredibly difficult to lose weight, because the same reward circuit that is set up for food is also the same circuit for nicotine, alcohol, and heroin. Now, how do we summarise this complexity? Well, I think the analogy that David Schroeder talks about with two angels. You've got an angel on each shoulder. Now, one of those angels, take this one here, is really the unconscious part of the brain. And that basically is the part of the brain that says, go on, just go and eat that cream bun, you know you like it. What the hell of it. And then you've got the other angel on the other shoulder that basically says, no, you shouldn't, because if you do, you gain weight and things like that. And it's a constant taggle between those two things. Now the problem is that the unconscious part of the reward centre is a lot bigger than the conscious part of the reward centre, the prefrontal cortex. And somebody's likened it to basically riding an elephant, and that the elephant is the unconscious part of the brain, and the prefrontal cortex, that's the bit that you have control over, is like riding the elephant, and sometimes that elephant just goes and does whatever it wants. And we've actually got very good evidence now. There's a new technique called functional MRI, which basically, when an individual is thinking about different things, we're able to scan the brain and actually see what part of the brains are active. Now, we have shown that people who are overweight, who are obese, basically have underactive prefrontal cortexes when it comes to food. Okay? And we've shown that those areas just don't light up as much as people who are thin and normal weight individuals. So, in another way of putting it, the command and control centre, the prefrontal cortex, is not working as well as people who are thin weight. So you can see I'm building up a picture of how It's very complex and there's multiple different pathways involved. Now, I'm going to talk about the set point BMI. I think this is very useful, and there's very good evidence that we all have a set point BMI. Now, where is that? Where is the key kept? It would be great to get the key, wouldn't it? It's probably somewhere in the hypothalamus, somewhere in that reptilian brain. There is a set point that says your set point BMI, your set point weight is this. And your body does everything it can to basically defend that set point. And that's why diets don't work a lot of the time, is that basically when you diet, it causes a post-dieting condition where all of the hormones change in your body to the point where you go into a point of starvation. And your body says, I'm starving, you need to get back to your set point BMI. That, I think, is normal. So, now on to the topic of how does the surgery work? Well, the easiest way to look at why obesity surgery works is that it really resets that set point BMI. It essentially lowers it. And of course, that's different from diets, and that diets don't lower that set point BMI. These hormonal changes that occur basically after dieting, they don't change, even at out to 10 years, even post-surgery, these hormonal changes are not changing. So the old theory of how obesity surgery worked was restriction and malabsorption, nice and easy, nice and simple, or a combination of both. So restriction, a gastric band or a sleeve gastrectomy creates a tiny wee stomach, and when you eat you feel full because you've only got a tiny wee stomach, and it restricts food. The gastric bypass obviously is an intestinal rerouting procedure causing a degree of malabsorption through short circuit, and obviously there's the restrictive component as well. What we now know is that those mechanisms are incorrect. Weight loss surgery is not working via restriction, and it's not working via malabsorption on the large part. It's actually working through hormones and nerves. Now, what evidence do we have to say that restriction and malabsorption are working? Well, we perform multiple gastric emptying studies where we radioactively tag food, scrambled egg, and we get people with bypass sleeve or band to eat it. And we can see that it literally whizzes through the stomach or the modified stomach. So there's actually not restriction occurring. Now, malabsorption. Gastric bypass is not a true malabsorptive operation. And when I mean malabsorptive, I mean macronutrient. I mean, true macronutrient absorption is somebody who basically develops steatorrhea, so basically they can't absorb their protein and fat, they end up with really fatty bowel motions. Now that doesn't happen with gastric bypass. Yes, you can get micronutrient deficiencies such as iron and calcium, but not macronutrients. So malabsorption isn't a cause. So if they're not working through those two mechanisms, how are they working? Well, the plain and simple answer is we don't know how it works, but it works really well. But we've got a few ideas. And like I alluded to earlier, weight loss surgery works via hormones and nerves. They are the predominant mechanisms. Obviously, there's lots of hormones that are changed, and we can measure these after surgery. There are significant changes to these hormones, such as ghrelin, which is produced in the stomach, which obviously is removed with sleeve gastrectomy, GLP-1, which is produced in the small intestine. They are changed. They are significantly changed post-surgery. And even when we measure them 10 years after surgery, they are still changed. So these hormonal changes are enduring and long-term. Nerves, I mean, there is the large nerve called the vagus nerve, which basically supplies information from our brain to all of our intestines. It has obviously nerves sending signals down from the brain. Most of the nerves are actually going from the gut back up to the brain. And for example, we know that there are stretch receptors in the stomach, and when they get stretched, signals basically are sent back to the brain to say, hey, I'm full. So in summary, obesity is largely due to genes, and it's clearly not just due to a lack of willpower. There are multiple complex mechanisms that the body uses to protect against weight loss. Bariatric surgery essentially resets the BMI to a lower set point. And how exactly that works, we don't know. Thanks very much.